Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first Zoom retreat, our first online retreat on the Four Noble Truths. Today is Monday, August 3rd. We are on the first day, 2020. We are on the first day of our retreat. And a couple of things I just want to do as sort of housekeeping things. We've started recording, which means that if you have something that you say on either Q&A or something along those lines, it will be recorded, and if you're concerned about that, maybe you shouldn't participate because it will be sent out later, and we'll archive it for that. So people should be aware of that. Every day we will start with our meditation led by our lovely chanting by Cornelia and Dick. And we will then have a sutra recitation followed by a Dharma talk, Q&A, a break. And for those who wish to continue, we'll have a Dharma discussion groups, which will break into smaller groups. So that's kind of how the outline of the retreat will go on this wonderful topic, the Four Noble Truths. Many people feel is the essential teaching of the Buddha. If you need to contact me as sort of the host of this retreat, the best way to do that is to send something in the chat. Also, if you have, when we get to situations like I will be asking for volunteers to read the sutra, the best thing to do, since I can't see the whole screen, is to raise your hand according to the Zoom manner, which is to sort of toggle under participants, and then there's a little tag for raise hand. So it's only appropriate that we start with the very thing that got all of this started, the Turning of the Wheel Sutra. And I'm wondering if there are two people who would like to sort of alternate parts in the reading of this. I will put it on the share screen if you don't have it available, and we'll go from there. So can we have two people who have volunteered to be readers? Anyone want to be a reader here this morning? Cass, thank you. And can we have a second person? So we can alternate that. Ro, thank you. So I'm going to put on the share screen here, and of course unmute yourself. The Turning of the Wheel Sutra, and just, I guess, alternate your readings, a paragraph too if they're small, until we're done. So, Cass, when you are ready, if you could begin.
Turning of the teaching. This is what I heard. The fortunate one was staying at Varanasi in the deer park in Sipatana. There he addressed the group of five mendicants as follows. There are two extremes that are not to be embraced by a person who has set out on the path. Which two? The practice of clinging to sensory pleasure in sensory objects. This practice is lowly, common, ordinary, dishonorable, and unprofitable. And the practice of exhausting oneself with austerities. This practice is distressful, dishonorable, and unprofitable.
Not tending toward either of these extremes, Tathagata, a person who has come to know reality, has completely awakened to the middle way. The middle way engenders insight and understanding and leads to calmness, to direct knowledge, to full awakening, to unbiting. So what is that middle way completely awakened to by a Tathagata? It is precisely this preeminent 8-component course, namely sound view, sound inclination, sound speech, sound action, sound livelihood, sound effort, sound awareness, and sound concentration. This is the middle way, realized by a Tathagata, which gives rise to vision and knowledge and leads to calmness, to direct knowledge, to full awakening, to unbiding.
I'm sorry. Sorry. Now this is unease. It is a preeminent reality. Birth is unsettling. Aging is unsettling. Illness is unsettling. Death is unsettling. Association with what is displeasing is unsettling. Separation from what is pleasing is unsettling. Not getting what is wanted is unsettling. In short, the 5 existential functions subject to grasping are unsettling. This is the origination of unease. It is preeminent reality. It is this craving that leads to further being, accompanied by passion and delight, seeking pleasure here and there. It is namely craving for sensual pleasures, craving for being, and craving for non-being. This is the cessation of unease. It is the preeminent reality. It is the complete dissolution and cessation of precisely that thirst, the relinquishment and rejection of it, freedom from it, non-attachment to it.
This is the way leading to the cessation of unease. It is a preeminent reality. It is this preeminent 8-component course, namely sound view, sound inclination, sound speech, sound action, sound livelihood, sound effort, sound awareness, and sound concentration. When I realized this is unease, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard. When I realized this unease is to be fully recognized, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard. When I realized this unease has been fully recognized, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard.
When I realized this is the origin of unease, those around arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard. When I realized the arising of unease is to be abandoned, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard. When I realized the arising of unease has been abandoned, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and the clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard. When I realized this is the cessation of unease, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard. When I realized the cessation of unease to be realized, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have been previously heard. When I realized the cessation of unease has been realized, there arose in me vision, insight, discernment, knowledge, and clarity concerning things that have not been previously heard.
I think I'm as long as my insight and vision concerning these 4 preeminent realities, just as they are in their 3 sequences and 12 aspects, was not completely purified, I did not claim to have fully realized, unsurpassed, complete awakening in this world with its resplendent beings, God and death, with its seekers and priests, its supernatural beings and humans. But as soon as my insight and vision concerning these four preeminent realities, just as they are, was completely purified, then did I claim to have fully realized unsurpassed complete awakening. The insight and vision arose in me. Unwavering is my release. This is the final birth. There is now no further becoming.
That is what the Fortune One said, exalted the group of 5 medicants, delighted at the words of the Fortunate One. And while this discourse was being spoken, there arose from the venerable Kandanya this dustless, stainless insight. All that is subject to origination is subject to cessation. And when the Fortunate One had set in motion the wheel of teaching, the resplendent earth-dwelling being cried out at Varanasi is the deer park in Esapatana. The Fortunate One has set in motion the unexcelled wheel of reaching, which can be stopped by any seeker or priest, any resplendent being, by God or death, or by anyone in the world. Hearing the resplendent earth-dwelling beings cry, resplendent beings throughout the cosmos cried out in the exact fashion.
Thus, at that moment, at that instant, at that second, the cry extended as far as the Brahma realm. And this 10,000-fold cosmos trembled, shook, and violently quaked, and an immeasurable great radiance appeared in the cosmos, exceeding the brilliant majesty of the resplendent beings themselves. Then the Fortunate One exclaimed this inspired utterance. So you really know, Kandana? So you really know. And that is how the Venerable Kandana acquired the name Ana Kundana, Kundanya, who knows.
Well, thank you all very much for that wonderful little, again, it always has those kinds of things. There's a lot of archaic things going on in there and a lot of repetition, but wonderfully inspired for the sutra, the very first thing that the Buddha talked about. The person in our Sangha who has had the wonderful energy and wisdom to wrap his consciousness around these sutras is our good friend Jeremy Packer, who's been leading our sutra study for a little over 3 years now, I think. We had a debate about how long that was yesterday. And it was with great pleasure that I introduced him to kind of talk about this sutra as we begin our journey through the Four Noble Truths. So, Jeremy, if you can begin whenever you like. So, thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming this evening. It's good to see so many friendly and familiar faces out there on my Zoom screen. And I have to tell you that I have a much larger audience for my Dharma talk than the Buddha had for his first Dharma talk, which is recorded in this sutra. So the sutra tells us that he gave this talk to a group of 5 basically homeless people, 5 mendicants or beggars, actually fanatical religious ascetics who live this life of deprivation in the hopes of finding some enlightenment. And at least some people believe that this group of beggars were in fact group of ascetics that the Buddha had practiced with over a period of 6 years and nearly starved himself to death in the process. Ultimately walked away from them, and he had come to this sort of practice of deprivation after studying with some of the greatest yogis of his time, and he ultimately walked away from them. And he made the decision to go out on his spiritual quest, of course, after seeing human suffering for the first time. So he was born a prince and lived this sheltered life, and finally went out in the world and saw old age and sickness and death and human suffering, and it set him on a spiritual path. So anyway, so this is his first audience. These guys that he had practiced with, and they probably weren't real thrilled to see him back. They thought he had become hopelessly decadent after leaving them. And fortunately for us, he was able to convince them to hear him out. So the content of his first talk is recorded in the sutra, which is, the Pali name for it is the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. It's a real mouthful, but it's commonly known as the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And Dharma in this case means the Buddha's teachings. So we actually talk about 3 turnings of the Dharma wheel in our tradition. And just as an aside, this image of the wheel, some people feel that it refers to these legendary kings, the wheel-turning kings, who had conquered large portions of Asia and India with their wheeled chariots. So the Buddhist teachings are said to have conquered the lands with their great power. So this is the first turning of the Dharma wheel, and so we could say that happened somewhere between 400 and 500 years before the Common Era. And then the second turning of the wheel takes place in a 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. So that's with the emergence of the emptiness teachings, the perfection of wisdom sutras like the Heart Sutra, and the philosophical writings of the philosopher Nagarjuna, who wrote about emptiness. And then there's a 3rd turning of the wheel in the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, associated with the emergence of the Yogacara school of philosophy, which Thich Nhat Hanh is definitely in that tradition. And that presents the 8 consciousness models of the human consciousness. And I'll talk about that more later. So, but this sutra is just about the first turning. So that's just additional information. So I want to look at the very beginning of the sutra. So he starts out, the Buddha, the first thing he talks about is the middle way. And he says, there are 2 extremes that are not to be embraced by a person who has set out on the path. Which 2? The practice of clinging to sensory pleasure and sensory objects. This practice is lowly, common, ordinary, dishonorable, and unprofitable. And the practice of exhausting oneself with austerities. This practice is distressful, dishonorable, and unprofitable. Not tending toward either of these extremes, a Tathagata is completely awakened the middle way. So he starts his talk with this very important concept of the middle way. And he's speaking from personal experience. He's lived both of these extremes. He started his life as a wealthy prince, supposedly, surrounded by sensory pleasures. And he gave this up, ultimately adopting a lifestyle of extreme asceticism. Neither of them worked out for him. And he's addressing a group of mendicants who are practicing this extreme asceticism, and he's saying to them, that's not the way. You haven't found the way. There's a middle way between these 2 extremes. It's going to work out much better for you. And then he goes on to say that there is a specific path, the Eightfold Path, that will, if you follow it, that will allow you to live this middle way. I'll get back to that Eightfold Path in more detail later on. So the main point I want to make is that the first thing he talks about is not the Four Noble Truths, it's the middle way. Very, very fundamental concept. So now we get to what we commonly refer to as the Four Noble Truths, or the translator that of the version that we read today he calls them preeminent realities. I think he's uncomfortable with the word noble and maybe uncomfortable with the word truth also. But I want to go back to the original Pali language word that we translate as noble truth or preeminent reality. And that word is Arya Sacha. So it's a hyphenated word, Arya hyphen Sacha. And Arya, we can translate that as noble in the sense that we usually use it as sort of elevated either socially or morally. But noble actually has another meaning that's less common in modern usage, and that means sort of pure or unsullied or uncorrupted. So where I remember seeing it is in chemistry class, we have these noble gases, neon, argon, helium, and they're pure because they don't like to combine with other elements. And so that's how I think of noble in this sense. So it's not a problematic term for me. So these are pure, incorruptible truths. So that's the word Arya. And then Sacha, which we translate as truths, or this translator of the sutra translated as realities. So the literal translation of that Pali word would be that which is. So the implication is that what we call the noble truths or preeminent realities are simply showing us things as they are. So this is not supposed to be a concept that the Buddha instructed. He's just showing us things as they are. So the first noble truth, or the first preeminent reality, we commonly refer to as the truth of suffering. Again, the translator that we read today, he translates it as unease, and I like that. So suffering, for a lot of us, and for me initially, when I heard the word suffering, I thought of great suffering, great physical suffering, great emotional suffering, anguish, pulling your hair and crying out. But it's not really that. I mean, it can be that, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be something a little more toned down. I think it has to do with the inherently unsatisfactory nature of our lives. I think essentially the world fails to give us what we want at all times. And so there's this sense of unease or unsatisfactoriness. And this is a form of suffering, but it's not the hair pulling kind of suffering. So the Buddha is very specific in the sutra in terms of types of suffering, and he gives us a list. He says, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, associating with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not getting what you want is suffering. So you either get what you want and that makes you suffer, or you don't get what you want and you suffer. And then finally he says, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging, or the 5 skandhas, are also suffering. So the first items on that list, I think we've all lived those forms of suffering. I just want, as far as the 5 aggregates, I just want to review that. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, but I think it'd be useful to go through the 5 aggregates and just talk a little bit about why they would cause suffering or unease. So you might remember that the 5 aggregates, or 5 skandhas, you could call them 5 heaps, are the 5 elements that comprise the self. So they are form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. So the first one, form, or rupa in Pali, means the material form of a person or any other thing. So if you think about yourself, your personal form is made up of a myriad of other things. So there's different chemical elements, we have cells, we have genetic material, we have bones, organs, we're made up of the food we eat, the air we breathe. So that's this term aggregate or heap, that's referring to the fact that each one of these skandhas is made up of a bunch of other things. So in any case, we know from our personal experience that our bodies are constantly changing, that someday we'll get sick and we'll die. So if we cling to our bodies, if we cling to this physical form, expect it to be permanent and unchanging, that's going to make us uneasy. That's going to give us some suffering. So that's the first skandha. The second one, feeling, or vedana in the Pali language, is our immediate response to what we take in with our senses. So it's not necessarily emotions as we think of them. The notion here is that you perceive something and you have an immediate, almost unconscious response. You like it, you dislike it, or you feel neutral about it. So you accept it, you're attracted to it, or you reject it, or you're just neutral. So so this operates almost below the level of conscious thought. But each time we react to a stimulus in a certain way, we store a seed in our consciousness, a karmic seed, and then the next time we encounter that same stimulus, we're very likely to respond in a similar way. So so that's feeling, and this conditioned response to me is a sort of important source of suffering too, because that conditioned response may not be appropriate to the situation. It's just our habit energy. That's feeling. Then the next skandha is perception. And so that's the perception is the process that recognizes and labels the information we get through our senses. And in Buddhism, we have not 5 senses, we have 6 senses. And there's a consciousness associated with each sense. So we have eye, ear, nose, mouth, and body consciousnesses. And they're associated with our senses of sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And then Buddhism adds this 6th consciousness, this 6th sense of mind. So we consider the mind to be a sense organ. So perception, the way we perceive, it's the result of the information that we take in with our sense organs, interacting with these seeds that we stored from past actions. So it's not objective in some scientific sense. We're filtering everything that we perceive through our past experiences. So the next skandha is mental formations, or samskara in the Pali language. And they're essentially states of mind that are triggered by what we perceive. So they lead us to act particular ways under certain circumstances. And some of these formations are wholesome and lead to positive actions, and some of them are unwholesome and cause suffering or unease. So then, the final skandha, the 5th skandha, is consciousness. And we can think of that as really combining the previous 4 skandhas, so taking all this form, feeling, perception, mental formation, putting it together, and creating consciousness. So I mentioned earlier that this guy, this Yogacara school of Buddhism that that we are in the tradition of. And in that school, we follow, it's an 8 consciousness model. So that the 8 consciousnesses are those 6 sense consciousnesses that I just went through. And then there's an additional 2 consciousnesses. We have a store consciousness, or alaya, and that's where we store those karmic seeds that affect our perception. And the manas, the mind consciousness, and that's where our sense of self resides. So the problem with clinging to these skandhas is that we believe that they're more substantial than they are. We don't always understand how interconnected all these pieces are. And I found a quote from another sutra that I thought described this better than I can do. So I'm going to just read from this sutra. It says, form is like a lump of foam, feeling like a water bubble. Perception is like a mirage. Mental formations are like a plantain tree, and consciousness is like an illusion. However one may ponder the self and carefully investigate it, it appears hollow and void when one views it carefully.
Jeremy, could you read that one more time, please? It was really good.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Flip back a page here. So form is like a lump of foam, feeling like a water bubble. Perception is like a mirage, and mental formations are like a plantain tree, and consciousness is like an illusion. However one may ponder the self and carefully investigate it, it appears hollow and void when one views it carefully. So clinging on to this hollow and void sense of the self created by the skandhas will lead to unease or suffering. So that's the first noble truth. He just talks about the nature and causes of suffering or unease. So the second noble truth or preeminent reality is to talk about the origin of suffering, where it comes from. And again, the Buddha gives a very specific definition. He says, the origin of suffering is craving, accompanied by passion and delight, seeking pleasure here and there. It is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for being, and craving for non-being. So we suffer because we ask more of the world than it's able to provide for us. We want to experience pleasure. We want things to be permanent. We want to live forever, and we want to attain nirvana. So these cravings keep us locked up in the cycle of death and rebirth. And you can take that figuratively or literally, depending on how you feel about reincarnation. And actually, in the Sutra study group, when we met on Saturday, we were talking about another fundamental Buddhist notion, the 12 links of interdependent origination. And I'm not going to go through that in great detail, but it's a process that starts with ignorance and eventually leads to old age, sickness, and death. So a very cheerful cycle. But in the middle of this 12 links, so these are, it's like a sequence or a process that we go through. There's a series that I think is important in this concept or in this context, talking about how our attachment, our craving leads to suffering. So picking this 12 links up in the middle, I'll pick it up with this mind body. So that's like the form, you know, of the 5 skandhas. So because we have a mind and body, we have the 6 senses. Because we have the 6 senses, we have contact. contact with the world around us. Because we have contact with the world around us, feeling arises. So feeling is the I like it, I don't like it, and I'm neutral. Because we have feeling, now we have craving. So now we want these things. Because we have craving, then we have grasping. So grasping in this cycle leads to existence, leads to the solidifying of this fluid world around us. And that leads to birth and then ultimately to aging and death. So, so the origin of suffering is this craving leading to grasping, and then just keeping us in this cycle, this bigger cycle of suffering. So that's the second noble truth of preeminent reality, the origin of suffering. And then the third truth or preeminent reality is the cessation of suffering. And the Buddha lays it out very clearly again. He says the cessation of suffering is the complete dissolution and cessation of craving, the relinquishing and rejection of it, freedom from it, non-attachment to it. So that seems easier said than done, at least in my experience. But once again, the Buddha gives us a very clear road to follow. And he gives us the Noble Eightfold Path. So I will briefly go through the 8 elements of the Eightfold Path. And this is the way to avoid suffering, the way to follow the middle way. So the first element is right view. So right view means, on one level, having insight into suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path. So having insight into the Four Noble Truths is an essential element of right view. Thich Nhat Hanh also describes right view as the ability to see and become familiar with both the wholesome and unwholesome seeds in our store consciousness. So there's these seeds of karma that we store in our store consciousness. And that's important because how we perceive the world is colored by these seeds. How we act in the world is colored by these seeds. So having some familiarity with what we have in our karmic storehouse is very important. And we can learn about that basically through mindfulness. So the first element is right view. The second one is right thinking. And again, according to Thich Nhat Hanh, this one means seeing things as they are. And in his writings, he gives 4 specific practices to help us with right thinking. So the first one is to ask yourself, are you sure? So when you're in a situation, before you act, ask yourself, are you sure? And to use a classic example, you see something lying in the path ahead of you, some long skinny thing. Is it a rope? Is it a snake? Is it a stick? So stop and make sure that you know which of those 3 it is before you react to it. So that's the first practice. Then the second one that he recommends is to ask yourself, what am I doing? So what am I doing right now? Are you fully present to what you are engaged in the present moment? And the third practice he gives is to say, hello, habit energy. Just to ask yourself if you're following a habitual pattern. Are you being ruled by one of the karmic seeds that's stored in your consciousness? And then the fourth one he asks you to keep in mind is bodhicitta. So awakened heart or an awakened mind. So are you bringing your mind of love to bear on the present situation? So that's right thinking. The next element of the path is right speech. And that's basically the 4th mindfulness training, which we'll be reading later in the week. And I'll just quote Thich Nhat Hanh again. He says, aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others, I am committed to cultivating loving speech and deep listening in order to bring joy and happiness to others and relieve others of their suffering. So I couldn't put it any better than that. And the next element is right action. And again, that relates to our 5 mindfulness trainings. That's refraining from taking life, from refraining from taking what is not given, refraining from sexual misconduct. So right action means right action of the body. It's the practice of touching love and preventing harm, the practice of nonviolence towards ourselves and others. The basis of right action, according to Thich Nhat Hanh, is to do everything in mindfulness. The next part of the path is right livelihood, and that just means practicing an occupation that's in accord with all the other elements of the path. You have to find a way to earn your living without transgressing your ideals of love and compassion. The 6th element of the path is right diligence, or right effort, and that means being diligent in your practice. It means striving to prevent unwholesome mental states from arising, to overcome unwholesome states that have already arisen, to generate beneficial mental states, and to maintain and develop beneficial mental states that have already arisen. The 7th step is right mindfulness. And this is a quote from one of the sutras. And it says, the practitioner being ardent, fully aware and mindful, and having put down longing and discontentment toward the world, lives seeing the body in and as a body, lives seeing feelings in and as feelings, lives seeing mind in and as mind, and lives seeing mental qualities in and as mental qualities. So living in full present moment awareness of things as they are. And then the final element of the path, the eighth element, is right concentration. And again, I'll quote Thich Nhat Hanh. So to practice concentration or samadhi is to live deeply in each moment that is given us to live. Samadhi means concentration. In order to be concentrated, we should be mindful, fully present, and fully aware of what is going on. Mindfulness brings about concentration. When you're deeply concentrated, you're absorbed in the moment. You become the moment. So that's the Eightfold Path. So now we've had the noble truths or preeminent realities. We've had the truth of suffering or unease. We've had the origin of suffering or unease. We've had the end of suffering or unease, and the path that leads to the end of suffering. So we've had now a couple of really 3 very important concepts in Buddhism, very fundamental concepts in this very short sutra. So we've had the middle way, we've had the Eightfold Path, we've had the 5 skandhas. And there's one more important concept that's kind of thrown in there. And there's this character that at first seems kind of minor, comes up at the end of the sutra, Kodanya, who becomes Anakodanya. So he's actually one of my favorite characters in this story because he just pops up seemingly out of nowhere. So, so while the Buddha is talking, this character Kodanya has this sudden enlightenment in the midst of hearing the Buddha talk. And his enlightenment consists of the awareness, as the sutra says, that all that is subject to origination is subject to cessation. So I'll say that again. All that is subject to origination is subject to cessation. So anything that is, another way to think of it is anything that is put together of the 5 skandhas is impermanent. So we have another really fundamental concept here, the concept of impermanence. And it's just, to me, it's surprising. It's just kind of tossed in there. We have this sudden enlightenment, and Kodanya is aware now of the principle of impermanence. And the Buddha considers it important enough that he recognizes it and gives Kodanya this title, the one who knows, Anya Kodanya. So I just want to say on the subject of enlightenment, and I'm going to wrap things up here because it's getting late. On the subject of enlightenment, these sudden enlightenments, you do come across them in the sutras, and they're in other stories, particularly in Zen Buddhism, of somebody having this sudden awakening. They'll hear somebody give a particular talk in this case, and become suddenly awakened, or maybe their Zen master will whack them over the back with it, and they'll become enlightened. But I want to close by asking you to keep in mind that enlightenment is not the goal here. To use one of my favorite quotes from Chögyam Trungpa, so a Tibetan teacher, the path itself is the goal. And I have I'm going to close with a quote from the Buddha from another sutra that addresses this question of enlightenment. And he says, "It is not important whether one is fully enlightened. The question is whether you want to liberate yourself. If you do, practice the Noble Eightfold Path. Wherever the path is practiced, joy, peace, and insight are there." So thank you all for listening, and I will take questions.
Thanks, Jeremy. So the best way, especially since there are more people that are on my screen that are off, again, if you toggle under participants, there's a place called raise hand. And that's the easiest way. You can try to bow and I'll try to see you, but the best way to do it is to get a raise hand if you can. If you have any questions here for Jeremy, thank you for that wonderful teaching. You covered everything. I don't need to do anything the rest of the week. Everybody take the rest of the day off. I'm hoping to take this foundation and delve into it a little bit deeper over the next. So, Colleen Fitzgerald, you raised your hand.
I did. Jeremy, what you offered at the very end, do I want to liberate myself? Could you, I'm assuming I'm understanding what I'd be liberating myself from, but could you just say a little bit about that? Liberating myself from craving, from...
Yeah, so yeah, ultimately you're liberating yourself from suffering by liberating yourself from the attachment to this notion of a self, of a independently existing self. So the image, the liberation image that I really like actually comes from the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra has a section where it goes to the skandhas and it's saying no form, no feeling, no perception, no mental formations, no consciousness. It's kind of like that little gatha I read about, the form being like a lump of foam. So I kind of picture I kind of picture these notions of the five skandhas of the self like a physical wall we built around ourselves. And each time we see one of the skandhas as essentially empty, we've thrown away one of the bricks that make up that wall. So we've imprisoned ourselves in this notion of a self, and the liberation that we get is by knocking down those walls, by seeing the, seeing the sense of self as a foam, lump of foam or a bubble or a mirage, and that's freeing, that we're not tied to this conceptualization of the self.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ro?
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Jeremy, I'm just wondering, is the fourth noble truth, is what you're saying, was the concept of impermanence?
No, the fourth noble truth is the eightfold path.
Okay.
This path that leads to the end of suffering. So this is giving us a roadmap that there is a path that we can follow that will take us towards the end of suffering.
Okay. So I probably just need to read up on that, because I had that as the third one, but I can check that out. But I wanted to, I was wondering about your fascination with Anyo Kodana. You said you liked him because he popped up somehow.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could say more about that. Like,
I don't know, I mean, this whole sutra up to this point has been this very heady talk by the Buddha. There's this one main character, this really important guy, the Buddha, and he's expounding on his middle way and his eightfold path, and in the middle of it, this homeless guy, one of the 5 homeless beggars, has this powerful realization about the nature of reality. He has this flash of insight that everything changes. So I don't know, there's something I like about that. It sort of comes out of nowhere. It's a nice little dramatic flourish. Keeps the sutra interesting. But it also introduces this concept of impermanence that actually, if you ask me, to figured out the one most essential concept in Buddhism for me is this concept of impermanence. You can derive almost everything else in Buddhism from that concept. So it's a very important little flash of enlightenment.
thank you.
Thanks. Paul Broadway?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk, Jeremy. And it's always great to read the sutra from the Glenn Wallace book and to think about it again. But I'm just going to piggyback on Rose's question about Kondanya, this guy who the name. And you're right, it's weird. I mean, this as a literary thing. It's the very final paragraph of the sutra, but this person, his name is not even mentioned. I mean, he like the name is not even there, and then all of a sudden that's how it ends. I mean, I think that what's striking about that, kind of as you said, the notion of like sudden enlightenment, and the possibility of that is made clear, or is raised in any case in the final paragraph. And the way I would say it is this: I mean, what does sudden enlightenment mean? I mean, one of the meanings is that simply by understanding this argument, sort of by really wrapping your brains around this argument, kind of like a mental act, or being so mentally receptive, so psychologically ready to take in these truths, that itself has a transformative effect on somebody. And usually we think of, progress usually I think of progress on the path being incremental, being gradual, and not being the result of like a deep insight alone, usually I think of progress in the path. I mean, for me, it's involved, like lots of meditation time, and like mucking around kind of in the weeds of like one particular teaching or another, and using different meditation techniques, and maybe devotion, or fellowship, like discovering the possibility of healthy relationships in the Sangha, and all those things, all those little elements and ingredients, when you add them all up, and it could be like a lot of things you're adding up there, is what helps me to know the truth. But the sutra is kind of like supercharged in a sense, because as you said, like the sutra has kind of like the quintessence of a lot of like a lot of Buddhist teachings. And for me, I think if I fully, the possibility here is that if I fully realize that the self is is empty, as he says, as the self is hollow, the self is there's actually no deep substantial continuity in the self. And if I realize that things outside the self are all interdependent, and there's no single substance. The big thing that I want is actually there's not one single thing. It's like made up of everything else. So if my wanting is a sort of process that comes and goes, and if the thing that I want is also actually not a thing, but a process that comes and goes, maybe that realization itself would lead to saying, oh, well, the whole thing is just a big charade anyway. The whole wanting and being upset and suffering because I don't get what I want is almost like logically impossible. And it's just like thirst, what he calls in here tanha, the craving. Craving is like a logical error. It's like trying to insist that twice 2 makes 5, just because of the way the world is set up. So I think that again, there's a possibility which he raises in the final paragraph that, just like taking in the sutra itself, minus the 50 plus years of life and meditation and interactions with other people in the Sangha, just this really kind of like digging down, what's the phrase, taking a deep dive into into this presentation might be enough to kind of like convince you to sort of overthrow the whole kind of suffering game. Anyway, that's my interpretation of that final paragraph. What do you think?
Well, thanks, Paul. Yeah, that's great. That's a great summation of the whole thing. And, on that concept of, what you were talking about at the end about, you could take 50 years of practice to come to this, or you could have sudden enlightenment. I think I go back to the story of the Buddha's life, because he spent years wandering around, following these different teachers, trying these gruesome ascetic practices, and then he finally sits down and meditates for a day, some people say a few days. And then just in that short period of time, to me, that's a sudden awakening too. If I meditated for 24 hours and became the Buddha, that would be pretty incredible. And in the sutra, he actually talks about the Buddha actually sort of gives us a little glimpse of the process by which he became awakened, say, to the noble truths, the preeminent realities, because he said for each one, he first had an awareness of the truth. This is suffering, and then he had an awareness of what needed to be done with that truth, and then he had a realization that he had done what he needed, so he had a realization of suffering, and then he had the realization that suffering needed to be understood, and then he had the realization that he had understood suffering, and then he went on to the next truth. So he talks a little bit about that process, but it's all very, very sudden. And that's why I put that little quote at the end of my talk, stressing that enlightenment is it's not a question of enlightenment. It's a question of following the path. That's the real importance. It's nice to be Kodanya and get a special nickname and get recognized But the main thing is that, is to practice, just to follow the path.
Thanks. Are there other questions? Bonnie? Do you have a question? No. Okay. Jeremy, I have one quick little question. Could you discuss very briefly, because we don't have a lot of time, about sutras in general and why, in particular, this particular translation by Glenn Wallace is something that you chose? So,
Well, sutras in general. Wow. What I wanted to say about the sutras in general. I will say something about why I became interested in sutra studies. So, so the sutras, so the Pali Sutras, what we call, the sutras that were written in the Pali language, they're all supposed to be records of actual talks given by the Buddha. Now, in our tradition, we have others sutras like the Perfection of Wisdom sutras that are later. They didn't appear initially in the Pali language, but these are the ones in the Pali language, like this sutra. They're supposed to be actual records of talks that the Buddha gave, and that they were originally passed on as orally. And then they were written down, hundreds of years after the Buddha lived, if there was a Buddha. And they've been translated many times. And the confirmation that we have that these are the words of the Buddha, a lot of times you'll see in these Pali Sutras, it will start out saying, "Thus I have heard." And the person that's saying, "Thus I have heard," is the Buddha's sidekick, Ananda, who is supposed to have memorized, knew by heart every Dharma talk that the Buddha ever gave. So, so when you see a sutra starting out with the words, "Thus I have heard," that's like an authentication stamp. So anyway, so these sutras have been translated many times. So it started out in the Pali language. They've been translated into, Chinese, into Sanskrit, now translated into English. And not surprisingly, there's many translations of this particular sutra available. Thich Nhat Hanh has one in his book, The Heart of the Buddhist Teaching, which I looked at. The Theravadan monk, Bhikkhu Bodhi, has a different translation that I also looked at. I chose this one by Glenn Wallace because, well, I like the way he translated it. So he's a Buddhist, but he's an academic. He's a scholar, and he tried to choose when he made choices about how to translate a term like, say, Arya Satya, he didn't want to use the term noble truth because he felt noble and truth both have connotations. He didn't want to use the word suffering when he translated the word dukkha, because suffering has this whole, there's all this cultural baggage with it. So he kind of strived to choose more neutral terminology. You can judge for yourself whether or not it works. I tend to go back to the traditional translation and say suffering and say noble truth, but he just gives a different point of view. He's not so personally invested as a monk like Thich Nhat Hanh or Bhikkhu Bodhi might be. So he's an insider in that he's a Buddhist, but he's not as caught up in the monastic culture as some of the other translators.
Any other questions here for Jeremy? Well, thank you all for your kind attendance this morning. I am hoping to flesh out a little bit more about each of the Four Noble Truths of the next 4 days, but I'm very happy for Jeremy giving us a very sort of strong foundation on this. So at this point, I'm going to close the recording for today.